In the dim light of the Alcazar Palace, a portrait hangs like a warning from history. The face that stares back defies nature itself, a jaw so grotesquely elongated it hangs open in perpetual gape, a tongue too swollen for its mouth, eyes that bulge with the weight of genetic catastrophe. This is Charles II of Spain, the last of his line, the living embodiment of what happens when bloodlines become obsessions. The year is 1665. In the royal chambers of Madrid, court physician Dr. Francisco de la Torre approaches the 4-year-old prince with trembling hands. What he sees makes him step back, crossing himself. The child before him can barely hold up his own head. It's too large, too heavy, rolling on a neck too weak to support it. Saliva drips constantly from lips that cannot close. The boy's legs, twisted and feeble, dangle uselessly. This is not just a sick child. This is centuries of sin made flesh. The Habsburgs ruled half of Europe through one simple principle: divine blood must remain pure. Uncle married niece. First cousins wed first cousins. The same names appear again and again in the family tree, until it's no longer a tree but a twisted vine, strangling itself. They believed their blood was blessed by God, too precious to dilute with outsiders. They would learn through Charles that even God has limits to his mercy. The irony cuts deep as a Toledo blade. Here was the most powerful dynasty in European history, rulers of Spain, Austria, the Netherlands, vast swathes of the New World, and they had bred themselves into a genetic dead end. The very strategy meant to preserve their power would destroy it. The blood they guarded so jealously had turned to poison in their veins. Dr. de la Torre's medical notes from that first examination survive, written in a shaking hand. His Majesty the Prince shows signs of significant abnormality. The jaw protrudes beyond natural bounds. The tongue appears enlarged. Mental faculties uncertain. Physical development severely impaired. He stops short of writing what everyone in that room was thinking: this child is barely human. But Charles II wasn't born in a vacuum. He was the culmination of a mathematical horror story written in DNA. Every marriage between cousins, every union of uncle and niece, had been another step toward this moment. The Habsburgs hadn't just played God. They had tried to become gods, keeping their bloodline so exclusive that it folded in on itself like a collapsing star. The question that haunts us across the centuries is this: how did the pursuit of perfection create such a perfect monster? How did the dream of a divine bloodline become a waking nightmare that would end an empire? To understand Charles II's tragedy, we must first map the labyrinth of blood that created him. Picture, if you will, a family tree, but instead of branches spreading outward, watch them curve back, intertwining, until you cannot tell where one generation ends and another begins. It started innocently enough. Royal marriages were political tools, and who better to trust than family? But the Habsburgs took this principle to its grotesque extreme. By the time Charles II was born, his family tree was more of a family wreath. His father, Philip IV of Spain, had married his own niece, Mariana of Austria. She was the daughter of Philip's sister, making her both Charles's mother and his cousin. But that was just the beginning of the genetic nightmare. Mariana's parents were also closely related. Her father was Philip IV's brother-in-law, and her mother was Philip's sister. Go back another generation, and the web grows tighter. Charles's great-great-great-grandparents, Philip I and Joanna of Castile, appear in his bloodline 14 times. Not once, not twice, 14 separate times The genes funnel down into this one tragic child. Modern geneticists have calculated Charles II's inbreeding coefficient, a measure of how closely related his parents were. The number is staggering, 0.254. To put this in perspective, the child of brother and sister would have a coefficient of 0.25. Charles II was more inbred than if his parents had been siblings. The political logic was ruthless and simple. Spain controlled vast wealth from the Americas. Austria held the crown of the Holy Roman Empire. The Netherlands generated enormous trading revenues. Why let these prizes slip to other families through marriage? Keep it all within the Habsburg blood. Every union between cousins was another padlock on the family treasure chest. In the grand halls of the Hofburg Palace in Vienna and the Escorial in Spain, negotiations weren't about bringing in fresh alliances. They were about recycling the same bloodlines. Portraits of potential brides and grooms were exchanged, but look closely at those paintings. The same features appear again and again: the prominent jaw, the drooping lower lip, the bulging eyes. The Habsburgs were marrying mirror images of themselves. The Spanish branch was particularly isolated. While their Austrian cousins occasionally married outside the immediate family, Spain doubled down on purity. Between 1516 and 1700, Spanish Habsburg kings married within the family at a rate that would make ancient Egyptian pharaohs blush. They created a genetic bottleneck so severe that by Charles II's time, he had only 4 great-grandparents instead of the usual 8, and only 6 great-great-grandparents instead of 16. Court astronomers cast horoscopes to determine auspicious wedding dates. Priests blessed these unions as holy. Poets wrote verses celebrating the pure blood of the dynasty. No one seemed to notice, or dare to mention, that each generation was weaker than the last. The Habsburg jaw grew more renounced. Infant mortality soared. Mental instability increased. But still, they persisted, trapped in a prison of their own making. November 6, 1661. The bells of Madrid should have rung in celebration. Instead, an eerie silence fell over the royal palace as Maria Anna of Austria writhed in the final stages of labor. This was her 4th pregnancy. The previous 3 had ended in miscarriages or stillbirths. The dynasty's future hung by a thread as thin as spider's silk. When Charles finally emerged into the world, the midwives fell silent. The court physicians exchanged glances over the infant's misshapen form. His head was enormously swollen, his limbs twisted and weak, but he was alive, barely, and he was male. In that moment, the fate of an empire was sealed in the body of a child who should never have survived his first night. The court records, sanitized for public consumption, speak of a prince of delicate constitution, but private letters tell a different story. The papal nuncio wrote to Rome, "The prince is so weak that he cannot support his own head. His appearance causes great consternation among those who see him." A French diplomat was more blunt. "The child appears more dead than alive." Maria Anna, exhausted and traumatized, could barely look at her son. She had been only 14 when she married her uncle Philip IV, himself a product of generations of inbreeding. Now, at 27, she had finally produced an heir. But at what cost? Courtiers whispered that she wept for days after the birth, though whether from relief or horror, none could say. The baptism was a macabre spectacle. Charles had to be propped up with hidden supports, his oversized head balanced carefully to prevent it from lolling to one side. The holy water seemed to revive him momentarily. He let out a weak cry that sounded more animal than human. The Archbishop of Toledo, Percy, performing the ceremony, later confided that he had never felt such a sense of dread while administering a sacrament. Dr. Francisco de la Torre's private medical notes, discovered centuries later in the palace archives, paint a picture of barely controlled panic. The prince cannot close his mouth due to the projection of the mandible. The tongue is of unusual size and texture. Feeding presents extreme difficulties. He cannot latch properly and risks choking with every swallow. The cranium shows signs of hydrocephalus. Muscle tone is virtually absent. Reflexes are delayed or missing entirely. But perhaps the most chilling entry comes 3 weeks after the birth. His Majesty the King visited the prince today. Upon seeing the child, he turned pale and left without speaking. Her Majesty the Queen Mother has ordered that no portraits be made until the prince improves. I fear no improvement will come. The nursery became a fortress of secrecy. Only a select few were allowed to see the prince. Wet nurses were sworn to silence on pain of death. When foreign ambassadors inquired about the heir's health, they were told he was progressing admirably, while being kept far from the royal apartments where his cries, weak, strangled sounds, echoed through the night. Yet somehow, against all medical probability, Charles clung to life. It was as if fate itself had decided that the Habsburg line deserved a slower, more agonizing death than simple extinction. The child who couldn't nurse properly, who suffered constant seizures, who couldn't even hold up his own head. This was to be the future King of Spain, ruler of an empire upon which the sun never set. The palace halls of Charles's childhood were lined with mirrors, a cruel joke for a child who could barely recognize his own reflection as human. By age 4, when other royal children were learning to ride and fence, Charles still could not walk. His legs, thin as winter branches, buckled under even his slight weight. Servants carried him ever. I were in specially designed chairs that supported his massive head. Language came late and imperfectly. His swollen tongue and malformed jaw made speech almost impossible. When he finally began to talk at age 5, His words were so slurred and distorted that only his closest attendants could understand him. Foreign ambassadors would later describe audiences with the young prince where they smiled and nodded, having no idea what he was trying to say. The court physicians tried everything. Mercury treatments that left him retching for days, bloodletting that drained what little strength he had, religious relics pressed against his twisted limbs, exorcisms, for surely, some whispered, this child was cursed by God. Through it all, Charles endured with a patience that broke the hearts of those who witnessed it. He knew he was different. He knew he was mocked. Education was a farce wrapped in silk and ceremony. The finest tutors in Europe were brought to Madrid, but what use was Latin grammar to a child who could barely speak Spanish? What good were lessons in statecraft when he couldn't sit upright for more than minutes at a time? His tutors' reports are exercises in diplomatic fiction. His Majesty shows unique approaches to learning meant he couldn't grasp basic concepts. The prince demonstrates careful consideration meant he stared blankly for hours. At age 8, a miracle, or perhaps a curse, Charles finally took his first steps. The court erupted in celebration, but those who saw him walk away from the public eye told a different story. His gait was shuffling, unsteady, like a marionette with tangled strings. He could manage only a few steps before exhaustion overtook him. Still, it was progress of a sort. The loneliness of his childhood defies imagination. Other children were kept away, partly to protect the prince from disease, partly to protect them from the sight of him. His only companions were servants, tutors, and the portraits of his ancestors that lined the palace walls. Those painted Habsburgs with their jutting jaws seemed to mock him. They had been strong enough to conquer worlds, while he couldn't conquer his own body. His mother, Maria Anna, tried to shield him from the worst of the court's cruelty, but she was fighting a losing battle. Servants whispered, courtiers stared, foreign visitors barely concealed their shock. Charles developed a habit of covering his mouth with his hand, trying to hide the jaw that wouldn't close, the tongue that wouldn't fit. He knew what he was. The knowledge was there in his bulging eyes, a terrible awareness that he was nature's mistake. Religious devotion became his only escape. Unable to participate in the physical world, Charles retreated into the spiritual. He would spend hours in the palace chapel, propped up before the altar, mumbling prayers through his malformed mouth. Some saw piety. Others saw a desperate child bargaining with God for a miracle that would never come. By age 10, it was clear that Charles would survive to adulthood, a reality that filled the court with secret dread. A dead prince could be mourned and replaced. A living but incapacitated king was a disaster waiting to happen. The vultures were already circling. France's son king, Louis XIV, made no secret of his designs on Spanish territory. The Austrian Habsburgs began positioning themselves as the healthy branch of the family. Everyone could see the end coming, except the Spanish court, trapped in its web of denial and protocol. November 6, 1675. Charles II's 14th birthday marked his official majority, the day a Habsburg prince became a kins. The coronation was a masterpiece of illusion, a desperate attempt to transform genetic catastrophe into royal majesty. For weeks, the court had prepared. Tailors worked miracles to create robes that would hide his twisted frame. The throne was secretly modified with hidden supports. Every detail was choreographed to minimize the new king's exposure. The ceremony itself was an exercise in collective delusion. Charles, barely able to stand even with support, was practically carried to the throne. His coronation robes, weighted with gold thread and jewels, threatened to topple him at any moment. When he spoke the coronation oath, his slurred words were translated by the archbishop, who spoke clearly what the king could not. Foreign ambassadors in attendance left vivid accounts. The French envoy wrote, "The King of Spain has a face that would frighten children. His jaw hangs so low that his teeth cannot meet. His tongue lolls out like a panting dog. When he attempts to speak, saliva flies from his mouth. This is the master of the Spanish Empire. God help us all." The Dutch representative was equally brutal. "One cannot look upon him without pity or revulsion. His head seems too large for his body too weak for life itself." During the ceremony, he nearly fainted twice. Courtiers pretended not to notice as they discreetly held him upright. But perhaps the most damning account comes from the papal nuncio. "I have seen the future of Spain, and it is a walking corpse. The king cannot eat solid food. It must be mashed like an infant's meal. He cannot ride a horse. cannot sign his name without assistance, cannot even blow his own nose. Yet we must all bow and pretend this is normal. The charade is unbearable. The court developed elaborate protocols to hide the king's disabilities. Audiences were kept brief and carefully staged. Charles would be positioned on his throne before visitors entered, eliminating the need for him to walk. A servant stood behind a curtain, ready to steady him if he began to topple. Documents requiring the royal signature were guided by the steady hand of an aide. When the king ate in public, a rare occurrence, special utensils were used to minimize the spillage from his inability to close his mouth. Yet Charles was not entirely without intelligence. Behind those bulging eyes was a mind that understood his situation with painful clarity. He knew he was a puppet, knew he was mocked, knew his very existence was a burden to the empire. Court observers noted moments of surprising lucidity when the king would make an astute observation or show flashes of wit. These moments made his condition all the more tragic. He was aware enough to understand his own inadequacy. The business of government, of course, could not wait for a king who spent most days in bed, racked by seizures and infections. His mother, Maria Anna, continued as regent in all but name. When she died in 1696, power passed to a series of favourites and advisers who ruled in Charles's name, while the king retreated further into religious obsession and physical decay. The palace became a Gothic nightmare. Charles, convinced he was cursed, surrounded himself with priests and mystics. Exorcisms were performed regularly. The king would spend hours confessing sins he hadn't committed, begging God to lift whatever curse had twisted his body and mind. He began to believe he was bewitched, and given his appearance and condition, who could blame him? Meanwhile, Europe watched and waited. The Spanish Empire, once the mightiest in the world, was ruled by a king who couldn't rule himself. It was only a Mao. Drove time before the vultures descended. The only question was whether Charles would die before or after his empire collapsed entirely. The bride was 18, beautiful, and French. Marie-Louise of Orléans arrived in Spain in November 1679 with the hopes of two nations resting on her young shoulders. She was to be the saviour of the Habsburg line, the womb that would produce the miracle heir. No one had told her the full truth about her husband-to-be. The first meeting between Marie-Louise and Charles was carefully orchestrated. The king was positioned in flattering light, seated to hide his weaknesses, surrounded by the grandeur of the Spanish court. Still, witnesses reported that the French princess visibly paled when she first laid eyes on her future husband. She recovered quickly. She was well trained in royal protocol, but that moment of instinctive revulsion would define their marriage. The wedding night was a catastrophe wrapped in silk sheets. Charles, 19 years old, but with the physical development of a sickly child, was incapable of consummating the marriage. His malformed body simply could not perform the act necessary to produce an heir. Marie-Louise, raised in the libertine court of Versailles, found herself trapped in a nightmare of impotence and frustration. For 10 years, the charade continued. The court physicians subjected both king and queen to increasingly desperate fertility treatments. Charles was fed everything from bull's blood to powdered pearls. Marie-Louise endured examinations that would be considered torture today. Prayer vigils were held. Pilgrimages were made. The queen's menstrual cycles became matters of state discussion. Each month that passed without pregnancy was another nail in the dynasty's coffin. Marie-Louise's letters to France paint a picture of profound isolation and despair. "I am married to a shadow," she wrote, to her former governess. "He tries to be kind, but what use is kindness when one needs a husband? I am a widow with a living spouse, a queen without a kingdom, a wife without a marriage." The court, desperate for someone to blame, turned on the queen. Whispers of witchcraft began. Surely she was preventing conception through French sorcery. Her every move was watched, her food tested for contraceptive herbs. The pressure drove Marie-Louise to seek comfort in eating, and her once slim figure grew heavy. This only added to Charles's inability to perform his marital duties. By 1689, Marie-Louise was dead at age 26. The official cause was listed as appendicitis, but many suspected poison. She had become an inconvenient reminder of the king's failures. Her death was barely mourned. The court was already searching for a replacement, another womb to attempt the impossible task of bearing Charles's child. The second bride came from Germany. Maria Anna of Neuburg was selected for her family's supposed fertility. Her mother had borne 23 children. Surely, the court reasoned, such fecundity would overcome even Charles's disabilities. The new queen arrived in 1690 with determination and German practicality. She would succeed where the French princess had failed. But biology cannot be overcome by willpower. Maria Anna found herself in the same impossible situation as her predecessor. Charles, now 30 and in declining health, was even less capable of fathering a child than before. The new queen, however, was made of sterner stuff. Instead of retreating into despair, she threw herself into palace intrigue, accumulating power and influence while her husband retreated further into religious mania. The fertility treatments grew more bizarre. Charles was made to wear amulets of supposed potency. The royal couple was forced to sleep with religious relics between them. Mystics and charlatans promised miracle cures for prices that drained the already empty treasury. One Italian doctor prescribed a diet of raw eggs and wine that left Charles violently ill for weeks. Maria Anna's own writings reveal the grotesque reality of her marriage. The king tries nightly to perform his duty, but it is like watching a child play at being a man. He weeps with frustration. I comfort him as one would a son, not a husband. We are both prisoners of his wretched body. The absence of an heir became a European obsession. Ambassadors sent coded reports about the king's attempts at procreation. Betting pools formed in foreign courts, wagering on whether Charles could father a child before he died. The Spanish succession became the dominant question of European diplomacy. Who would inherit when the inevitable happened? Both marriages had been desperate attempts to deny reality. The Habsburg bloodline hadn't just been weakened by centuries of inbreeding, it had been fundamentally broken. Charles II wasn't just infertile, he was the living end of his line, a genetic full stop to centuries of dynastic ambition. His wives were not queens but nurses, tending to a dying dynasty that refused to acknowledge its own demise. As Charles's body failed, so too did his empire. The Spain of 1690 was a hollow shell of its former glory, a giant corpse, still dressed in the finery of its golden age. The treasury was empty, drained by wars, corruption, and the vast expenses of maintaining a court that produced nothing but ceremony. In the streets of Madrid, beggars outnumbered merchants. In the countryside, fields lay fallow as peasants fled crushing taxes. The king's physical decay mirrored his kingdom's collapse with eerie precision. By his 30s, Charles could barely digest food. His stomach, ravaged by years of mercury treatments and bizarre remedies, rejected all but the blandest liquids. He grew skeletally thin, his skin hanging loose on his malformed frame. Infections plagued him constantly. His immune system, weakened by genetic disorders, could fight off the simplest diseases. The court became a macabre theatre of denial. Ministers presented reports of imaginary victories to a king who could barely comprehend them. Courtiers competed for positions in a government that governed nothing. Foreign ambassadors negotiated with shadows while real power slipped away to France, Austria, and England. The Spanish Empire, which had once dominated the world, couldn't even control its own capital. Charles's mental state deteriorated alongside his physical health. He became convinced he was bewitched, and given his appearance and condition, who could argue? The palace filled with exorcists and mystics. The king would spend days in prayer, begging God to lift the curse he believed afflicted him. He saw demons in shadows, heard voices in the wind. Whether this was madness or simply the logical response to his situation remains unclear. The most detailed account of Charles's condition comes from his autopsy, a document so shocking it was hidden for decades. The royal physicians found a body that defied medical understanding. His heart was the size of a peppercorn. His lungs were corroded. His intestines were putrid and gangrenous. His stomach was filled with black liquid. He had a single shrunken testicle. His brain, upon examination, contained barely a drop of fluid. But even before death, Charles had become a walking medical curiosity. He suffered from constant seizures that left him unconscious for hours. His famous Habsburg jaw had grown so pronounced that his mouth hung permanently open, drooling continuously. His tongue, swollen and black, protruded grotesquely. Courtiers reported that the smell of decay followed him. His body was rotting while he still lived. The final years saw increasingly desperate attempts to produce an heir. Fertility doctors from across Europe descended on Madrid, each promising miracle cures. Charles was subjected to treatments that bordered on torture, potions that caused violent convulsions, vigor-inducing diets that left him weaker than before, even primitive surgical attempts to correct his genital deformities. All failed. By 1698, Charles was king in name only. He spent most days in bed, emerging only for religious ceremonies where he had to be physically supported by attendants. His signature on state documents was guided by other hands. Foreign powers openly discussed partitioning Spain as if the king were already dead. The court split into factions, each backing different successors, while Charles mumbled prayers and begged for death. The empire that had once made Europe tremble was reduced to a death watch. Ships rotted in harbors for lack of funds to maintain them. The armies that had dominated battlefields couldn't afford powder for their guns. The gold and silver of the Americas, which had once flowed to Spain in rivers, now barely trickled. Most was seized by pirates or diverted to pay impossible debts. The sun still never set on the Spanish Empire, but only because it was too vast to die quickly. October 1700. In the dim chambers of the Alcazar, death finally came calling for Charles II, but even dying, it seemed, was beyond the broken king's capability. For days he lingered in agony, his body refusing to grant him the mercy of a quick end. The death rattle in his throat competed with his prayers for divine forgiveness. He was convinced he was damned. How else to explain the curse of his existence? The deathbed became a diplomatic battlefield. Representatives from France and Austria hovered like vultures, each trying to ensure their candidate would be named in the king's will. Charles, barely conscious, was manipulated like a puppet. Papers were thrust before his failing eyes. Advisors whispered contradictory counsel. The fate of an empire hung on the ravings of a die. Man who could barely remember his own name. In his final days, Charles's hallucinations intensified. He screamed about demons tearing at his flesh, begged forgiveness for sins he couldn't name, called out for his long-dead mother. The exorcists worked in shifts, performing ritual after ritual over the writhing king. The smell of incense couldn't mask the stench of decay that filled the chamber. On November 1st, 1700, All Saints' Day, with bitter irony, Charles II finally escaped his genetic prison. He was 38 years old but looked ancient, his body so twisted and wasted that preparing it for burial proved challenging. The embalmers reported that his corpse seemed to decompose with unusual speed, as if even in death his body rejected its own existence. The will he left behind was as confused as his reign. Under pressure from various factions, Charles had changed his testament multiple times. The final version named Philip of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV of France, as his heir, a decision that would plunge Europe into 13 years of warfare. The War of Spanish Succession would claim over 700,000 lives, all because one twisted branch of a family tree had finally snapped. The autopsy, performed with unusual thoroughness, revealed the full extent of Charles's genetic catastrophe. His body was a catalogue of impossibilities. Beyond the shrunken heart and corroded lungs, physicians found kidneys filled with stones, a liver spotted with gangrene, and blood so thin it was barely red. His skull, when opened, revealed a brain that had atrophied to a fraction of normal size. One physician wrote in awe, "It is a miracle this creature lived an hour, let alone 38 years." News of Charles's death spread across Europe with the speed of relief. In Paris, Louis XIV openly celebrated. His grandson would be King of Spain. In Vienna, the Habsburg court raged at losing their Spanish inheritance. In London, merchants calculated the profits to be made from the coming war. Everyone, it seemed, had been waiting for this moment. The funeral was a final act of royal theatre. Charles's body, dressed in the finest robes that could hide his deformities, was displayed in state. Mourners filed past, many seeing the king clearly for the first time. The shock on their faces told its own story. This grotesque corpse had ruled an empire. This genetic disaster had been their sovereign. The pretense that had sustained the reign could finally be dropped. Spain itself seemed to exhale with Charles's last breath. The impossible was over. The Habsburg line that had ruled for nearly 2 centuries was extinct, ended not by war or revolution, but by its own corrupted blood. The dynasty that had believed itself too pure to mix with common blood had proved that purity and poison were sometimes the same thing. In the end, Charles II of Spain stands as history's greatest genetic cautionary tale. The Habsburgs had believed their blood was divine, blessed by God, too precious to dilute with outsider marriages. They guarded their bloodline like dragons hoarding gold, and like dragons, they became monsters of their own making. The mathematics of their downfall are as precise as they are horrifying. Each marriage between cousins doubled down on genetic risks. Each union of uncle and niece compounded the probability of disaster. By the time Charles was born, he wasn't just inbred, he was the mathematical endpoint of inbreeding itself. Modern geneticists studying his family tree have marveled that he existed at all. He carried so many recessive genes, so many genetic dead ends, that his survival to adulthood defies probability. But what makes Charles's story truly tragic is not just the physical horror, it's the awareness behind those bulging eyes. He knew he was a monster. He knew he was mocked. He knew his very existence was a burden to the empire he was born to rule. Every mirror reflected his deformity. Every failed attempt to produce an heir reminded him of his inadequacy. He was smart enough to understand his own tragedy, but powerless to escape it. The Habsburgs' pursuit of genetic purity had created its perfect opposite, a king so impure in body and function that he could barely be called human. They had tried to concentrate power and instead created powerlessness incarnate. They had tried to preserve their divine right and instead proved that even kings were subject to nature's laws. Was Charles II evil? History judges him as perhaps the worst king Spain ever had. Under his reign, the empire collapsed, the economy crumbled, and the nation became a laughingstock. But how can we blame a man who never had a choice? He didn't choose to be born from a union of uncle and niece. He didn't choose to carry the genetic burden of centuries of inbreeding. He was not a villain, but a victim, perhaps history's most royal victim. The final irony is that Charles's death sparked a war that killed hundreds of thousands, reshaping Europe's balance of power forever. The Habsburgs' attempt to keep power within the family ultimately scattered it to the winds. Their bloodline, so jealously guarded, ended with a whimper in a palace that smelled of decay and incense. Modern science tells us what the Habsburgs learned too late. Genetic diversity is not weakness, but strength. Every time they married within the family, they were playing Russian roulette with loaded chambers. Charles II was simply the inevitable moment when all chambers fired at once. Today, in the Prado Museum, Charles's portraits still hang tier, statement to artists who try to make monsters look like kings. But look closely at those paintings. See past the royal regalia and courtly poses. Look at the jaw that couldn't close, the eyes that bulge with genetic pressure, the whole face that speaks of nature pushed beyond its limits. This is what happens when human ambition tries to transcend human biology. The Habsburgs believed they were preserving something pure and sacred. Instead, they created a living demonstration of humanity's limits. In trying to become more than human through selective breeding, they became less than human. Charles II didn't die from disease or age. He died from centuries of accumulated genetic arrogance. His story echoes through history as a warning. Power corrupts, but absolute genetic power corrupts absolutely. The pure blood the Habsburgs sought became the poison that killed them. And Charles II, the king who could barely live, stands forever as the monument to their folly. A man destroyed by the very blood that was supposed to make him divine,